For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant, a minor species from an unremarkable system, clinging to survival on the edge of galactic relevance. Too young, too divided, too emotional. The Galactic Council catalogued humans the way one catalogues background radiation: present, measurable, and ultimately unimportant. They were ignored by the galaxy, dismissed by those in power, mentioned only in footnotes and projections that assumed failure as a matter of time. Humanity's early expansion drew mild curiosity at best. Their ships were inelegant, their technology functional but unimpressive, their politics chaotic by galactic standards. Council observers noted their tendency to argue among themselves and concluded, confidently, that humanity would never unify long enough to matter. When humans asked for equal trade access, the requests were delayed. When they protested territorial encroachment, the protests were archived. When their colonies struggled under unfair restrictions, the Council advised patience. Time, after all, favored the old. The Council had ruled for millennia by mastering one simple truth: most problems solve themselves if you waited long enough. Young species burned bright, burned fast, and faded. Humanity would do the same. So the Council tried to silence them. Not with fleets or weapons, that would have required effort. Instead, with policy. Human voices were reduced in council chambers. Trade lanes were rerouted. Diplomatic access narrowed. Information flow slowed to a trickle. Humanity was not attacked. They were excluded. The Council expected outrage, fragmentation, collapse. Instead, humanity went quiet. Human transmissions dwindled. Trade traffic declined. Their once noisy networks fell eerily silent. To Council analysts, it looked like decay, the early stages of cultural and economic failure. Charts were updated. Timelines shortened. Humanity was labeled a non-issue. What the Council never understood was that silence was not surrender. Humans had learned something fundamental long before they reached the stars. When voices are ignored, shouting is useless. When systems are stacked against you, survival demands adaptation, not permission. So humanity stopped performing. They stopped explaining themselves to an audience that had already decided the ending. They turned inward, sharing knowledge freely, consolidating resources, and learning how the galaxy truly worked, by watching it from the outside. They studied the Council's habits, its arrogance, its reliance on predictability. They learned how power behaved when it believed it was unquestioned. And slowly, deliberately, humanity changed. The Council mistook quiet for weakness. They mistook patience for compliance. They mistook insignificance for safety. No one realized how dangerous that mistake would be. Because when humanity finally spoke again, it would not be in chambers or treaties. It would be written in gravity and light. And the stars themselves would answer. The Galactic Council tightened its grip without ever calling it oppression. No war was declared. No fleets crossed human borders. That would have required acknowledging humanity as a rival. Instead, the Council did what it had perfected over thousands of cycles: rule through procedure. Trade was cut first. Shipping corridors that had supplied human colonies for generations were quietly reclassified. Permits expired and were never renewed. Tariffs rose overnight, justified by market instability and regulatory realignment. Cargo vessels bound for human systems were delayed, inspected, or redirected until routes became economically impossible. Essential resources vanished from human markets. The Council called it adjustment. Humanity felt it as suffocation. When human delegates protested, they found the doors narrowing. Speaking time in council chambers was reduced. Voting rights were suspended pending behavioral review. Appeals disappeared into committees designed to never reach conclusions. Rights were revoked one clause at a time. Human research institutions lost access to shared data networks. Exploration licenses were withdrawn. Migration permissions were restricted, trapping millions in systems stripped of economic viability. Isolation was not announced. It was engineered. Humanity was pushed to the margins of galactic infrastructure, away from shared trade, shared knowledge, shared influence. Neighboring powers, encouraged by quiet council indifference, expanded into contested regions. Human warnings were dismissed as emotional exaggeration. Human losses were recorded as statistical corrections. The Council expected collapse. Their models were confident. Humans relied too heavily on external supply chains. Their politics were fractured. Their cultures noisy and inefficient. Cut them off long enough, and they would turn inward, competing for dwindling resources until they shattered. Some council members spoke openly of inevitability. A regrettable outcome. A necessary lesson. Proof that the Council's order endures. Humanity did not riot. There were no galaxy-wide broadcasts of outrage. No dramatic last stands. Instead, human systems began to change in ways the Council did not monitor closely enough. Production shifted inward. Colonies once built for export were retooled for self-sufficiency. Black market innovation became sanctioned necessity. Every restriction forced a workaround. Every loss became a design challenge. Human signals to the wider galaxy thinned, not through destruction, but intent. Navigation beacons went dark. Data traffic narrowed to tightly focused transmissions. Entire systems reduced their external emissions until they blended into cosmic background noise. Council observers logged the silence as decline. Timelines were shortened. Humanity's projected collapse was moved forward. What the Council never considered was that isolation was not a sentence. It was freedom. Freed from oversight, freed from imposed standards, freed from expectations, humanity began operating on its own rhythm. Decisions that once took years were made in months. Projects once rejected as too dangerous were pursued without hesitation. The Council waited patiently. They believed time was still their ally. They never noticed when time stopped working against humanity and started working for them. Isolation didn't break humanity. It accomplished what centuries of diplomacy, conflict, and ideology never could. It unified them. At first, old fractures remained. Nations argued out of habit. Corporations protected interests that no longer existed. Colonies clung to regional identities shaped by distance and history. Humanity had always been divided, convinced that someone else, some authority beyond themselves, would intervene before consequences became irreversible. Isolation erased that belief. When the last major trade lanes collapsed, the reality became unavoidable. No world could survive alone. Medical shortages in one system were meaningless without manufacturing in another. Energy-rich colonies depended on food producers light years away. Knowledge scattered across fractured networks had to be shared or be lost forever. Survival demanded cooperation. Emergency summits were called, not for politics, but logistics. Former rivals sat at the same tables without ceremony. Old accusations were dropped, not forgiven, simply rendered irrelevant. Borders blurred as resources flowed freely across them. Militaries stopped posturing and began coordinating supply, defense, and evacuation planning. Arguments ended the moment extinction entered the room. The first unified command was provisional, formed to manage shortages and stabilize colonies. The second integrated defense and infrastructure. By the third, no one pretended this was temporary. Every colony voted. For the first time in human history, the result was unanimous. All planetary defense forces, industrial capacity, and off-world infrastructure would answer to a single authority. There were no flags raised. No anthems played. No leaders crowned. This was not conquest. It was consolidation. The unified human command emerged quietly, born of necessity rather than ambition. Humanity finally understood a truth the Council never had: survival does not negotiate. Colonies that once competed now specialized. Production chains were rebuilt for redundancy instead of efficiency. Research was shared without restriction. Scientists stopped protecting discoveries and began weaponizing solutions. Unity accelerated everything. Technologies once stalled by regulation advanced rapidly. Shipyards expanded beneath asteroid crusts and within hollowed moons. Civilian infrastructure was redesigned to function in isolation indefinitely. Children grew up learning a single sobering lesson, that no one beyond their species would come to save them. Culture shifted with purpose. Art became restrained, focused, and resolute. Stories stopped dreaming of belonging and started teaching endurance. History was rewritten, not to glorify the past, but to ensure its mistakes were never repeated. Humanity did not become kinder. They became focused. As unity deepened, external signals faded entirely. Navigation beacons went dark. Long-range broadcasts ceased. Even passive emissions were reduced until human space became indistinguishable from empty stars. To the Council, humanity had gone silent. To itself, humanity had become whole. Defense doctrine evolved rapidly. Humanity stopped preparing for war and began preparing for abandonment. Every scenario assumed worst-case conditions: total isolation, overwhelming enemy force, loss of entire systems without warning. Victory was no longer the goal. Continuity was. If one world fell, others would endure. If fleets were destroyed, replacements would rise. Humanity redesigned itself so that no single failure could end them. And beneath it all lay a shared understanding, simple, unspoken, and absolute. If no one else would protect them, humanity would protect itself. By the time the Council archived humanity as a species in terminal decline, unity was complete. What they believed was silence was, in truth, resolve. And the stars were beginning to notice. In silence, humanity evolved. There were no announcements, no demonstrations meant to impress an audience that had already looked away. Progress unfolded far from trade lanes and observation posts, beneath asteroid fields, within hollowed moons, and deep inside systems long dismissed as unremarkable. Human engineers began by abandoning inherited limitations. The engines that once powered human vessels had been designed to meet Council efficiency standards and regulatory constraints. Those standards were discarded. New drives emerged, systems that no longer pushed against space, but reshaped it. Test ships vanished from orbit and appeared light minutes away without crossing the intervening distance. Travel became repositioning. Energy followed the same path. Reactors were redesigned for endurance, not peak output. Layered redundancies ensured continuous operation even under catastrophic failure conditions. Where older designs accepted breakdown as inevitable, new human doctrine rejected it entirely. Then came the shields. Council defenses relied on dispersion and overload thresholds refined over millennia. Human shields ignored those assumptions. They adapted dynamically, reshaping themselves to incoming energy profiles. Impacts were absorbed, redistributed, and nullified without visible flare or degradation. Archived Council weapon data was used for testing. The results never changed. No breach. No fatigue. No adaptation required from the defender. Fleets were built around these advances, but not as symbols of dominance. Human ships were dense, angular, and utilitarian, designed to function independently for decades. Every vessel carried its own manufacturing capacity. Every fleet could fracture into autonomous elements without losing cohesion. There were no ceremonial flagships. There was no center to destroy. Command structures were distributed, hardened against decapitation. Authority flowed where it was needed and vanished where it was not. Human fleets did not depend on singular leaders or centralized control. Humanity studied the galaxy closely during this time. They examined how empires rose, how they overextended, and how they collapsed. Patterns emerged. Power failed not from lack of strength, but from rigidity, systems unable to adapt when reality diverged from expectation. Human doctrine was built to bend. Weapons research advanced quietly. Entire projects were compartmentalized so deeply that even human worlds knew only fragments of their existence. Dead systems, long ignored by the galaxy, were repurposed as testing grounds. Brief gravitational distortions and momentary stellar dimming went unnoticed by anyone who was not looking. Humanity did not pursue destruction. They pursued certainty. Communication evolved as well. Broad-spectrum transmissions were abandoned. Human signals became narrow, precise, and nearly impossible to intercept without foreknowledge. Humanity did not hide through stealth alone, they hid through discipline. While the galaxy expanded, argued, and postured, humanity refined. While the Council debated influence and precedence, human fleets drilled in silence, rehearsing scenarios that assumed everything would go wrong: total isolation, overwhelming force, no allies, no warning. Survival was the metric. By the time subtle anomalies reached the edge of Council awareness, empty systems behaving incorrectly, gravity refusing to obey established models. Humanity was ready. The Council believed it had silenced a weak species. In truth, it had given humanity exactly what it needed: time. And humanity used it without wasting a moment. Then a new enemy appeared. It did not announce itself with ceremony or doctrine. There was no declaration, no warning carried ahead of its fleets. One cycle, a frontier system, failed to report. The next, an entire sector vanished from the map, trade lanes gone, relays silent, stars burning where cities had once existed. The survivors named them the Dominion. Not because that was what they called themselves, but because domination was the only constant in their wake. Worlds fell. Not after prolonged sieges or heroic last stands, but with terrifying efficiency. Dominion fleets emerged in overwhelming numbers, their formations dense and unrelenting. Planetary shields, some refined over thousands of years, collapsed in minutes. Orbital defenses were neutralized before they could coordinate. Communications were severed first, ensuring no warnings traveled ahead of the invasion. Systems died quietly. Species were enslaved. Populations were catalogued, stripped of culture and autonomy, and repurposed as labor across occupied space. Some were relocated to industrial worlds under permanent supervision. Others were dispersed so thoroughly that entire civilizations ceased to exist as coherent identities. Resistance proved meaningless. Council fleets engaged wherever they could, confident in doctrines honed over millennia. They lost. Repeatedly. Every tactic that worked once failed the second time. Dominion forces adapted faster than Council strategists could revise projections. Each battle fed the enemy more data, more certainty. The Dominion did not fear war. They optimized it. The Council responded as it always had. They argued. Emergency chambers filled with voices debating definitions while real-time star maps updated behind them, red zones expanding outward like a spreading infection. Committees were formed to assign responsibility. Votes stalled over resource allocation. Fleets were promised, then delayed, then redirected as political interests shifted. Systems burned while syntax was debated. Some Council members fortified their borders and quietly withdrew support, calculating that sacrifice elsewhere might buy them time. Others demanded concessions before committing forces. Unity fractured under pressure, exposing the fragility of an order built on patience rather than resolve. Panic finally set in when a founding Council world fell. Not a fringe colony. Not a junior member. A core system. The final transmission was calm, disturbingly so. Cities stood intact. Infrastructure undamaged. The planet had not been destroyed. It had been claimed. The illusion of safety collapsed overnight. Ancient emergency powers were invoked. Defense clauses long considered ceremonial were activated. Fleets were mobilized at last, too scattered, too constrained, too late. Losses mounted rapidly as Dominion forces pressed inward, their advance accelerating with every victory. Desperation forced the unthinkable. Someone reopened the archives. Humanity. Status. Silenced. Projection. Collapse imminent. But the data no longer made sense. Old sensor records were re-examined, unexplained fleet losses near former human space, anomalous gravitational readings, navigation failures with no apparent cause. Patterns emerged that Council analysts had once dismissed as statistical noise. A possibility took shape. Humanity had not collapsed. They had withdrawn. Reconnaissance probes were dispatched toward human territory. Most never returned. Those that did transmitted fragmented data, distorted readings, masked energy signatures, and unmistakable evidence of large-scale, organized infrastructure. Human fleets. Not massed at borders. Not postured for conquest. Layered. Deep. Prepared. Defensive networks spanned entire systems, integrated so completely they appeared as single entities. No borders were marked, yet nothing crossed without being noticed. Humanity had not vanished. They had been waiting. The Council did not celebrate the discovery. They argued. Some demanded immediate alliance overtures. Others insisted on formal apologies and restitution. A few suggested leverage. Humanity had once been weak, after all. Surely pressure could still be applied. The irony went unspoken. When the Dominion breached another sector, this one perilously close to the Council's core, the arguments ended. A single transmission was authorized, carefully worded, restrained, stripped of open arrogance, though traces remained. The Council requested assistance. And for the first time in its long history, the Galactic Council waited for an answer from the species it had tried to silence. From the quiet it had created. From humanity. The Council expected forgiveness. They prepared carefully measured apologies, statements admitting procedural oversight and regrettable miscalculations, crafted to sound remorseful without surrendering authority. Envoys rehearsed language meant to remind humanity of its former role within the galactic order, assuming the past could be smoothed over with enough diplomacy. They believed humanity would be grateful to be needed again. They found resolve. The response did not arrive through sanctioned council channels. It appeared simultaneously across council space, overriding encryption and linguistic barriers with effortless precision. A single transmission. The image showed a human seated in a plane chamber. No banners. No insignia. No visible symbols of rank or power. The setting was deliberately unremarkable. When the human spoke, the voice was calm. "We acknowledge your request." The chamber went silent. "We are aware of the Dominion. We have observed your losses. We understand the urgency of your situation." There was a pause, not theatrical, but deliberate. For generations, you chose when humanity was allowed to speak. When our concerns warranted response. When our survival mattered. No anger colored the words. That time has passed. Council representatives demanded clarification. They invoked shared defense precedents and ancient accords humanity had once sought entry into and been denied. They spoke of unity, of necessity, of the greater good. The human listened. Then answered with absolute certainty. "We will decide when to act." No threats followed. No timelines were offered. No reassurance was given. The transmission ended. In the cycles that followed, the Council waited, exposed and helpless. Dominion forces continued their advance, systems falling faster as Council defenses collapsed under pressure. Every loss reinforced a growing realization: authority had already shifted. Then the universe began to misbehave. Gravitational sensors across multiple sectors reported fluctuations that violated established constants. Trade lanes warped. Navigation calculations contradicted themselves. Stars dimmed fractionally, as if something vast had moved between them and the observers. Energy readings spiked in synchronized patterns, immense, controlled, unmistakably artificial. Human systems long believed dormant began to change. Structures unfolded from concealment fields, spanning thousands of kilometers. Fleets repositioned without visible acceleration, appearing where nothing had existed moments before. Defensive networks activated in cascading layers, locking into configurations no council model could interpret. Humanity was not mobilizing. They were executing. The Council finally understood the meaning behind humanity's words. Time was no longer a buffer. It was a countdown. And when humanity chose to act, the stars themselves would respond. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. There was no warning, no hyperspace flare, no gravitational wake. One moment, the void between stars was empty. The next, it was filled with human vessels arranged in formations so precise that Council sensors struggled to interpret them. Massive hulls locked into geometric alignment, each ship positioned with mathematical certainty. No engines burned. No weapons charged. No shields flared in anticipation. The fleets did not advance. They arrived. Dominion forces detected them seconds later. Targeting arrays snapped to readiness. Weapon systems charged. Tactical AIs flooded command nodes with threat analyses that refused to converge. Before the Dominion could fire, a message crossed every channel. Not transmitted. Not broadcast. Inserted. It bypassed encryption, ignored language barriers, and resolved itself into meaning for every sentient mind that received it. Stand down. There was no threat attached. No ultimatum. No explanation. The Dominion answered with fire. Planet-cracking beams tore through the void toward the human fleets. Missile salvos saturated predicted movement vectors. Kinetic barrages filled space with destruction. They struck nothing. Human ships were already elsewhere, repositioned without observable acceleration, as though distance itself had become optional. Dominion fire passed harmlessly through empty space, targeting solutions obsolete before weapon cycles could complete. Then humanity responded. There was no barrage, no explosion, no spectacle. Entire Dominion formations lost power simultaneously. Engines shut down. Weapons went dark. Command links collapsed in perfect unison. Ships drifted, intact and helpless, their crews alive but blind, deaf, and isolated. Where resistance persisted, space folded. Localized gravitational distortions crushed weapon systems inward, disabling them without breaching hulls. Dominion vessels found themselves trapped in regions where momentum no longer obeyed familiar rules. The engagement did not escalate. It concluded. Across multiple sectors, Dominion forces were neutralized in minutes. Not destroyed, not routed, not humiliated. Contained. Council observers watched in stunned silence as real-time feeds updated faster than comprehension allowed. Battles that should have taken months ended before emergency resolutions could be drafted. Dominion Command attempted retreat. There was nowhere to go. Human fleets anticipated every vector, every contingency, every desperate maneuver. Reinforcement signals vanished before they were fully formed. Escape routes collapsed into navigational impossibilities. The Dominion had prepared for war. Humanity had prepared for certainty. The final transmission came from a human command node, calm, precise, and absolute. Hostilities are concluded. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. And the galaxy would never mistake human silence for weakness again. The Council tried to reclaim control. Emergency sessions were called in chambers that had once echoed with unquestioned authority. New resolutions were drafted. Jurisdiction was debated. Committees were formed to determine responsibility for the aftermath of the war and to reassert the Council's role as the galaxy's guiding power. It was too late. Human fleets did not withdraw when the fighting ended. They did not claim systems, demand tribute, or install governors. They remained instead at critical junctions, along fractured borders, near destabilized regions, and beside worlds the Council had failed to protect. They did not command. They watched. Council envoys approached carefully, their tone noticeably altered. Requests for coordination replaced directives. Proposals replaced demands. Humanity responded politely, briefly, and without submission. There was no hostility in their words, but no deference either. The balance had shifted. Liberated species waited for conditions that never came. No oaths were required. No alliances enforced. Human ships repaired orbital infrastructure, restored communications, and departed without ceremony. Aid was given without expectation. Protection was offered without promise. Some species pledged loyalty. Humanity declined. Others asked for guarantees. Humanity gave none. Instead, they demonstrated something far more unsettling than rule. Consistency. Human patrols became a constant presence in regions once abandoned to chaos. Trade routes stabilized, not through Council policy or enforcement, but through certainty. Pirates vanished. Expansionist powers hesitated. Conflicts cooled before they could ignite. The galaxy adjusted its behavior, not because humanity ordered it to, but because it had seen what happened when humanity chose to act. The Council issued statements celebrating unity and cooperation, carefully framing the war's end as a triumph of galactic governance. Humanity did not challenge the narrative. They did not need credit. Across human space, fleets remained on alert. Engines stayed warm. Sensors stayed active. There were no celebrations, no monuments, no declarations of victory. Humanity did not mark the end of the war. They prepared for what came after. Because humanity had learned a lesson the galaxy was only beginning to understand. Darkness does not arrive with warning. It does not ask permission. It does not respect age, authority, or tradition. It emerges quietly, adapts quickly, and feeds on complacency. Humanity had once been silenced. They would not be unprepared again. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They did not seek thrones, councils, or empires built on arrogance and delay. They had simply proven a truth the stars themselves now seemed to remember. If darkness rises again, humanity will be there.